If you had only $1 left in your wallet, what would you do? Buy a loaf of bread, or save it just to make it through tomorrow. But the young woman in this story, on a freezing night in New York City, did something unthinkable. Something that brought one of the most powerful billionaires in America to tears. Before I continue, if you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can change the world, hit that subscribe button for Gentle Heart Stories right now, because this story is one you'll never forget. Winter in New York City has a beauty all its own, dazzling yet cold. Neon lights glitter above the bustling streets, their reflections shimmering across slippery sidewalks coated with a thin veil of snow. The towering skyscrapers stretch into the gray sky like icy giants standing watch over a city that never sleeps. Snow continues to fall, gently blanketing leafless trees and settling on the shoulders and hair of hurried passers-by. People bundle up in thick coats, heads bowed against the biting cold, weaving past each other on crowded sidewalks. The noise of honking cars, hurried footsteps, and overlapping voices creates a chaotic symphony in the heart of this sleepless city. That's New York in the winter, stunning and chilling. A beauty that isn't meant for everyone. It only feels warm if you have a heated apartment to go home to and a thick coat wrapped around you. But for the vulnerable, the ones trying to survive on the margins, New York offers only darkness, hunger, and loneliness with every breath. Amidst the dazzling lights are forgotten shadows, corners the world has chosen not to see. Emma, a petite young woman in her early 20s, had gentle brown eyes that always carried a softness, even though her face often showed signs of exhaustion. She worked the night shift at a small grocery store nestled between two tall buildings in a busy neighborhood. Her job wasn't anything special: sweeping, restocking shelves, manning the register, and occasionally wiping down counters after closing. Every day, she worked from late afternoon until midnight, just as the city began to quiet down, leaving behind the stray honks of cars and a few scattered footsteps. Despite the long hours, Emma's paycheck barely covered the overwhelming expenses of city life. High consumption taxes and a punishing income tax left little room for people like her to breathe. After rent, utilities, and groceries, her wallet was often left with only a few crumpled bills, enough for a loaf of bread or a packet of instant noodles. Emma lived alone in a tiny room on the fourth floor of an old, run-down building. The walls were peeling, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. Her space held just enough for a single bed, an old desk by the window, and a second-hand wardrobe she bought from a charity shop. Even in that sparse environment, Emma kept her home tidy, warm, and comforting in the best way she could. At the end of each month, as soon as her paycheck came in, she would sit at her desk, lay out her bills and receipts in neat rows, and carefully tally everything: rent, electricity, heating, phone, groceries, transportation. And then came the taxes, the part that always made her heart sink. New York, glamorous and expensive. Even basic necessities were heavily taxed. Income tax devoured a significant portion of her already meager salary. Every time she held her pay stub, Emma knew what was coming: another month of scraping by. Sometimes she'd have $3 left. Other months, only $1. Occasionally, not even that. On those days, Emma would skip meals, surviving on cheap noodles and tap water. But she never complained. In her eyes was always a flicker of hope, as if she believed that if she just held on, things would get better. Just blocks away, John was an elderly man with white hair, an unkempt beard, and deep lines etched across his weathered face, marks of years spent sleeping on sidewalks and park benches. He often sat curled up in a corner of the park near Emma's workplace, a place he'd claimed as shelter during the brutal winters. John wore a tattered coat, open-toed shoes, and clutched a thin blanket salvaged from a dumpster. Every day, he held a worn cardboard sign with shaky, fading letters, "Hungry and cold." The ink had bled from rain and snow, but the message still struck a chord in anyone who took a second to look. Not many knew John's story. Most people saw him as part of the scenery, a ghost of the city, ignored in the daily rush of urban life. But Emma always noticed. Whenever she passed by, she'd slow down, offer an old pastry, a cup of coffee, whatever little she had. Sometimes, just a soft smile or a gentle, "Good night, sir." In a completely different world, Richard Mason was a household name in American finance. Founder and chairman of a global conglomerate, he owned hotel chains, real estate, and luxury stores across the country. He lived in a lavish penthouse on the 68th floor of the tallest building in the city, where the entire skyline could be seen beneath his feet. Richard was the image of success, sophisticated, powerful, wealthy. His parties were frequented by the elite. The media hung on his every word, every handshake. But behind the glitz, he was a deeply lonely man. He'd grown up poor, in a slum on the city's edge. After building an empire, Richard buried his past beneath contracts, board meetings, and power deals. Love and emotion became distant memories. He couldn't even recall the last time he laughed from the heart, and then, as if by fate, on a snowy night in New York, these three souls found themselves at the same corner of the city. Emma, walking home from her shift with her last dollar in her pocket, John, still sitting in his park corner, holding his sign with tired eyes, and Richard Mason, just stepping out of a charity gala across the street, waiting in the back seat of a sleek black limousine, ready to head back to his silent penthouse. That winter night in New York was beautiful. And bitter. And unfair. On one side, a struggling girl with a single dollar. On the other, a billionaire in a luxury car. Between them, an old homeless man in the cold. And the snow kept falling. In that fleeting moment, 3 lives. 3 worlds. 3 strangers, collided, and that's where the story begins. That evening, Emma stood behind the cashier counter of the small grocery store where she worked the night shift. Her manager handed her a small envelope, her paycheck after a month of hard work. Emma's fingers, icy cold, trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were a payroll slip and a modest amount of cash. Emma quietly made her way to the tiny break room and sat down at a corner table. She spread out her bills in front of her. This month's rent had gone up again by a few dollars. Utility bills had surged due to the cold. Everyday expenses hadn't gotten any lighter. She calculated carefully, dollar by dollar, cent by cent. When she reached the deductions for sales tax and income tax, the remaining amount in her hands was nearly wiped out. Her eyes lingered on the final number at the bottom of the page, exactly $1. Just $1 left to survive the entire upcoming month. She blinked, took a deep breath, and held back the sigh forming at the corner of her lips. That thin piece of green paper now felt like the most fragile, yet precious thing she owned. As she left the store just before midnight, Emma wrapped her old scarf tightly around her neck and buried her hands deep into the pockets of her thin coat. Snow was still falling, the sidewalk slick with ice, and the wind whistled through the alleys like knives cutting through her skin. She walked through the familiar park, the shortcut to her run-down apartment building. Her stomach growled. Since afternoon, she hadn't eaten anything except a few leftover crumbs of stale bread. Hunger, exhaustion, and the cold combined into a shiver that coursed through her entire body. Each step grew heavier, Emma picked up her pace. Her hand instinctively clenched around the dollar bill in her pocket. Feeling the rough fabric of her worn wallet brushing against her fingertips. The dim streetlights cast a soft, scattered glow over the snow-covered path. In that moment, all she could think about was getting back to her tiny room, turning on the barely working heater, and sipping a cup of hot water to warm her belly. But as she turned onto the familiar street, she saw him, Mr. John, the homeless man she often passed by. He was still there, in his usual corner of the park, his back pressed against the freezing brick wall. His old coat was far too thin to keep out the winter chill, his face was pale, his cheeks sunken, his eyelids half-closed in weariness. His frail hands trembled as they gripped a crumpled paper cup, completely empty. Snow had gathered on his shoulders, forming delicate white patches. Every time the wind blew, his body curled in on itself, shivering violently. Emma stood still for a moment, her heart tightening in her chest. In her ears, she heard the wind howling, the soft crunch of falling snow, and Mr. John's faint, uneven breathing, like a silent cry for help in the freezing night. She could feel the last dollar in her pocket, just one, meager but enough for a small loaf of bread or a cup of hot chocolate from a street vendor. Just imagining the warmth of it made her stomach twist even more from hunger, but her eyes quietly returned to Mr. John. That old man was freezing, frail, and likely hungrier than she was. Emma bit her lip. Her mind filled with a storm of questions. If I keep it, at least tonight I could eat something. I'm cold too. And starving. But if I give it to him, it might warm his heart a little, even if it's just $1. I'll survive the hunger. But him. He might not make it through the night if no one helps. The internal struggle stung her eyes. She knew all too well, $1 meant the world to both her and him. But for Mr. John, right now, it could be a tiny, fragile hope, maybe just enough to get him through the night. Emma closed her eyes for a few seconds, trying to silence her growling stomach, trying to still her trembling body. Her instincts screamed at her to keep the dollar. She needed it. She needed to eat, to stay warm, to survive. That was basic human instinct, but then her heart grew heavy as she looked at Mr. John. A lonely, aging man, facing a night that could take his life. Her compassion spoke louder. She remembered the grateful look in his eyes every time she handed him an old sandwich or a lukewarm coffee. That look had stayed with her, comforting her through long, lonely nights. Two sides of her wrestled painfully, one of survival, one of kindness. No one else could understand just how much that $1 meant, not just to her, but to him too. Then, Emma took a deep breath, summoning all the courage she had. She reached into her coat pocket. Her fingertips touched the cold, delicate paper. She pulled it out, looked at the tiny bill under the dim glow of the streetlight, and stepped toward Mr. John. She sat beside him, her eyes gentle as they rested on the old man curled up in the cold. Without saying a word, Emma quietly placed the $1 bill into his frail, trembling hand. That small touch carried a flicker of warmth through the freezing night. Mr. John looked up, his tired eyes flickering with a faint spark of light. He moved his cracked lips and whispered softly, "Thank you. Sweet girl." Emma smiled, a gentle, genuine smile that glowed warmer than any street lamp. The smile of someone who chose humanity over hunger, compassion over selfishness. Even when she had nothing left, she stood up, clutched her old scarf, and turned to continue down the snowy path. The night was still cold. Her stomach still empty, but something warm stirred quietly in her chest. softly lighting up every heartbeat from within. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue the program, we kindly ask that you leave a comment sharing your thoughts and reflections below. If you find this story meaningful, don't hesitate to share it. Your support helps this channel grow and spreads kindness to those around us. We hope you find these listening moments truly heartwarming. That night, not far from where Emma and Mr. John were sitting, a sleek black limousine quietly pulled over by the side of the park. Inside the car, Richard Mason, the billionaire known across America, leaned back against the leather seat. His weary eyes gazing out through the fogged-up window. He had just left a lavish charity gala, where crystal glasses sparkled with red wine and tuxedos and glittering gowns shimmered under the lights. People had praised him all night, calling him a great philanthropist, a symbol of power and success. But in truth, Richard felt empty, as he had at every event like this for years. The car had stopped because the driver was taking a call, waiting for Richard's next destination. In that brief pause, Richard turned his head toward the park. Under the faint glow of a street lamp and the gentle curtain of falling snow, a quiet scene caught the attention of the lonely billionaire. Through the misted glass, speckled with snowflakes, Richard spotted a slender young woman. Her coat was thin, and her posture tired. He watched in silence as she stopped next to an old homeless man curled up at the base of a tree. Though the distance, the dark, and the window blurred the view, Richard's eyes remained fixed on her. He saw her bend down, search her pockets, and slowly pull out a small bill, gently placing it into the trembling hand of the elderly man. The street lamp cast a soft glow on her hair, now dotted with snow. Her face looked worn and cold, but kind. From his warm seat in the luxurious limousine, Richard was unexpectedly drawn to this image. Every slow, thoughtful motion of the girl gripped his attention in a way he hadn't felt in years. Richard squinted, surprised. It was clear, the girl wasn't well off. Her coat was fraying at the shoulders, her scarf looked worn, and she walked with the fatigue of someone carrying a heavy burden. She, too, was battling the brutal cold of New York's winter, and yet, despite everything, she still gave what little she had. Richard felt the weight of that generosity in the way she hesitated before reaching into her pocket. In the way her eyes looked at the old man, not with pity, but with sincere compassion, free of judgment. A question surfaced in his mind: why would a girl who has so little still choose to give? While the wealthy around me tonight traded flowery words about charity, not one of them truly shared anything. His surprise turned to deep admiration. What she gave wasn't much in material value, but it carried a profound weight of humanity. Richard continued watching every move of the girl, Emma, though he didn't yet know her name. His gaze lingered on her face, pale from the cold, eyes tired but still gentle, glowing with a warmth that seemed to defy the icy night. The way Emma leaned down, placed her last dollar in the old man's hand, then smiled, even as her lips were blue from the cold, struck a chord deep in Richard's chest. How long had it been since he'd seen such an honest smile, in the glamorous, powerful, and praise-filled world he lived in? Richard had lost touch with the simple warmth of kindness. Her eyes reminded him of a time when he was young, when he, too, was poor, and used to be moved by a grateful look. By a warm hand reaching out to hold his through hardship. And in that moment, he realized, that simple human kindness. He had let it slip away long ago. Richard watched the old homeless man receive the dollar with trembling hands, his thin fingers touching the small bill like it was the most precious thing on this cold night. Mr. John looked up, his aged eyes filling with tears. Tears rolled down his wrinkled cheeks, melting the snow that had settled in the corners of his eyes. His lips quivered as he whispered, "Thank you, young lady." You're so kind." Though his words were weak and broken, Richard could see clearly. There was a flicker of hope in Mr. John's eyes. A rare warmth that he probably hadn't felt once this entire winter. That dollar wasn't just money, it was a gesture of love, of compassion, a thread of humanity connecting two souls in a cold, forgotten corner of the city. The scene was simple, but it struck Richard in a way that took his breath away. In that quiet moment, he understood, there are things money can never buy, no matter how powerful, or rich, he might be. The limousine remained still by the roadside. Snow continued to fall outside the windows. But inside the car, Richard Mason sat frozen, eyes still locked on the image of the small girl disappearing into the night. He slowly looked down at his own hands, hands that had held millions of dollars, hands that had shaken some of the most powerful in the country. Now clenched quietly in his lap, a strange wave passed through his heart, warm and aching all at once. For decades, Richard had been surrounded by numbers, contracts, luxury cars, and praise. But this, a poor girl giving away a single dollar, had touched a forgotten place deep within him. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, letting the emotion sink in, something stirring, something tender, something real, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but knew with certainty. It was more genuine than anything he'd felt at any gala in his entire life. When the limousine came to a halt, Richard remained seated, motionless, as if unwilling to let go of the moment that had just passed. That night, the images of the girl and the old man still lingered vividly in his mind. But what was it about that scene that he couldn't look away from? As the sounds of honking and traffic buzzed outside, Richard suddenly felt himself being pulled back into a distant past, another cold night. Another wave of memories from a childhood steeped in poverty. When he was just a poor boy living in a small neighborhood in Brooklyn. Winter evenings were marked only by the howling wind slipping through broken window panes. Richard remembered the bitter hunger, the longing for a warm meal, a comforting hug, or even just a few coins to afford a bus ticket to school, but there was never enough. He remembered watching his classmates being picked up by their parents in fancy cars, while he trudged through life alone, with no guiding hand. Hunger. Hope. These were the only things he had carried through those bleak years. And now, with everything, wealth, power, fame, Richard was struck by a painful realization: the very things he had spent his life chasing had never truly satisfied him. More than ever, he felt the emptiness inside, the same hollow ache he once felt as a nameless boy in a forgotten neighborhood, just wishing for one chance to change his life. He sat in silence, staring out through the car window, the streetlights casting a soft glow over the snow-covered ground. Tonight, he felt completely lost amid the numbers, contracts, and business strategies he once believed were the purpose of his life. Money, influence, admiration from everyone around him had made him forget one profoundly important thing: humanity. He realized that on his journey of glory, he had been swept away by the wrong values. He had become used to making decisions based on profits and stock prices, forgetting that kindness and small gestures were the things that gave life its true meaning. That girl, with just $1, had made him question everything: kindness, compassion. The very things he had longed for as a poor child had faded into the background of his life. There was no longer space for these simple but powerful things. And now, he felt disconnected from the real world, from those who needed help the most. Richard couldn't forget that moment, when Emma pulled her last $1 bill from her coat pocket. That poor girl had so little, yet still found the courage to share her most precious possession with an old homeless man. That moment hit Richard like a slap in the face, snapping him out of his daze. It made him realize that true generosity didn't come from million-dollar checks, it came from small, heartfelt actions. The million-dollar donations he had announced at charity galas suddenly seemed hollow, performative, and meaningless. Those funds hadn't really changed anyone's life, they were nothing more than publicity stunts. But Emma's single dollar had entirely changed his view on what it means to give. After the limousine pulled away from the park, Richard didn't go home like he usually did. Instead, he stepped out of the car and began walking through the streets of New York, into the dark of night. The snow was falling heavier, yet he didn't feel the cold. The chill couldn't compare to the emptiness gnawing at his soul. He walked in silence, his eyes drifting to the forgotten lives all around him, people the world had left behind. He saw a boy begging for change, manual laborers, and lonely elderly folks. Each one carried a story no one bothered to listen to. Lives the world didn't even see, people everyone treated as invisible. They had nothing, yet in their eyes, Richard saw resilience, and a fragile kind of hope. With each step, with each cold breath, Richard began to wonder if he had been making the wrong choices his entire life. Had he ever really done something meaningful for society? Had he truly made a difference in the lives of people like Emma and John? As he passed through quiet street corners, Richard stopped at a small cafe. He sat down, stared through the foggy window, and asked himself a question that echoed through his soul. Why am I alive? Have I truly made a difference in this world? A nameless guilt weighed down on his heart. His entire life, Richard had been racing toward power, wealth, and prestige. But now, face to face with the simplicity of human suffering, he realized those things had never brought him peace. He knew he had to do something truly meaningful, not for fame or profit, but for humanity. He made a silent promise to himself, I will no longer let career ambition blind me to the true meaning of life. As dawn broke across the New York skyline, Richard didn't return to his luxurious mansion. Instead, he called for an emergency meeting with the company's leadership team. The executives, accustomed to strategy sessions and market forecasts, were baffled by the urgent meeting at such an early hour. But when Richard walked into the room, his eyes were different. He looked each one of them in the eye and said, "We are going to change how we do charity. We're going to invest in things that actually matter." From that day forward, Richard committed himself to focusing on real community-driven projects, ones that could genuinely help those in need. Not just polish the company's image. Since that day, Richard began to implement the changes he had thought about all night before. Every morning when he woke up, he no longer felt exhausted from work or the glamorous parties. He had a new mission. And that mission began with the announcement of the establishment of the Meaningful $1 Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting the homeless, low-income workers, and those struggling to make ends meet. The fund not only focused on charity projects but also aimed to reduce consumer taxes for employees in his corporation, especially those with low incomes. $1 may not mean much to the wealthy, but for those struggling to survive day by day, it could make a big difference. Richard no longer wanted to engage in superficial gestures, he wanted to do things that truly mattered. That's why he named the fund Meaningful $1, to remind everyone that small acts can create significant change. Richard also made strong commitments to the community, providing rent assistance to low-income workers, especially those who had been with him throughout the growth of the corporation. He didn't want to just be a cold, distant leader, but someone who could truly change the lives of those who needed help the most. One of Richard's first concrete actions was to offer free breakfasts to the homeless. He used his extensive network of grocery stores to provide free meals to the homeless across New York City. Every morning, store employees prepared hot meals, toast, fresh milk, and fruit, all free for anyone who needed them. Initially, when announcing this program, many doubted Richard's true intentions. They thought it was just a PR stunt, but as days passed, when the homeless lined up for breakfast at the stores, they began to see a real change. Richard wasn't just offering a charity ticket, he wanted to create real change in the lives of the forgotten people in society. He wanted them to feel the respect and empathy they truly deserved. His stores became places of warmth and care, not just places to shop. These free breakfasts helped thousands of homeless people find hope, a new beginning for those weary of a hopeless life. For Richard, nothing was more important than giving people opportunities. For the employees working in his corporation, he decided to organize a scholarship program for those wanting to pursue higher education but lacked the financial means to continue their studies. He believed everyone had their own potential, and with the right opportunity, they could rise. In addition, the program also included rent support for low-income employees, helping them stabilize their lives. Richard didn't just provide cash, he created long-term support policies to help them rise in life. He also established favorable loans that allowed employees to adjust their personal finances and reduce housing pressures. This is how he redefined the essence of prosperity. Instead of focusing solely on personal profit, Richard made his corporation an environment for the comprehensive development of everyone. It was a historic change, not only for his corporation but also for the impoverished communities he had once overlooked. Homeless individuals like John were not the only ones receiving support from Richard. Thanks to the Meaningful $1 program, he arranged stable housing and small but steady jobs for John and many other homeless people. Richard not only gave them shelter, but he also created opportunities for them to start over, even if it meant humble work. John, the man Emma had helped, was hired at one of Richard's stores. Although it was just a part-time job, for a homeless person, it was an opportunity to restart life. For John, every day at work was a day when he felt the respect and dignity he had once lost. He no longer felt like an outsider, but a part of society. When Richard decided to invite Emma to be the face of the Meaningful $1 fund, he thought the brave young girl would be the ideal model for those who wanted to change their lives. Emma had helped the homeless without thinking of herself. That was the ideal role model Richard wanted to promote. But when he met her, Emma humbly declined, "I'm just an ordinary person, I don't want to be the face of the campaign. I'm just doing what every other normal person should do," Emma said with a gentle smile. She didn't want to become a symbol of kindness, she just wanted to continue living a simple life, doing the work she loved and helping others in the way she could. Emma surprised Richard. The young girl didn't need recognition or praise, she just wanted to do what everyone should do. Emma's response was a profound reminder to Richard. She didn't want good deeds to become a game for building a reputation. She was simply doing what anyone should do, helping others, being kind, sharing what little she had. Her words resonated like a bell, waking Richard up to the realization that human kindness was not about self-promotion but about building a better community together. From then on, Richard was determined to continue this journey, not to prove himself, but to truly change the lives of people like Emma, John, and the homeless. As Richard looked back on everything that had happened, an indescribable feeling surged within him. From one simple act by Emma, her last dollar given to the homeless, everything had changed. His thoughts and decisions no longer revolved around making more profit or maintaining power. Everything now had a deeper meaning, a meaning that money could not buy. He stood by the window in his office, looking out over the vast city of New York, where life continued to bustle and change constantly. But in that moment, Richard didn't see the skyscrapers, the luxurious limousines, or the powerful meetings. He only thought of a poor woman who had given away the most precious thing she had, her last dollar. And Richard realized that sometimes, even a small act can create big waves, changing the world. He felt as if his eyes had been opened again, understanding that sometimes a world can change with just $1. That was the message Emma had unknowingly conveyed, not only to him, but to millions of others. What she had done had awakened kindness in the hearts of everyone, even a wealthy billionaire like him. And from that moment, Richard was determined to continue this journey, not for money or fame, but for the real change he could bring to the world. After giving away her last dollar and the events that followed, Emma returned to her life, but she felt warmer in her heart than ever before. Her life was still as simple as before, the night shifts at the grocery store, the small room she rented, and the days spent saving every penny. But there was one thing she clearly felt: she had planted a seed of kindness, an act that could change someone else's life, and that was an invaluable gift. She didn't expect recognition or money, but when she heard about the changes Richard had made thanks to the charity fund, she felt that she had done the right thing. Every time she thought back to the moment she gave away the dollar, she no longer felt like a poor person. Instead, she felt rich in love and compassion. Though it was a small act, it had created a large ripple effect. Emma had no idea that her story had become an inspiration for millions of people. But in her heart, she felt happiness knowing that her small act had sown the seeds of goodwill in society. $1, she thought, might not change the whole world, but at least it had changed a life. John was no longer the homeless man everyone often saw shivering in the cold of New York winters. After receiving support from Richard through the one meaningful dollar charity, his life had turned a new page. A small warm house had been arranged for John, where he no longer had to huddle under the snow every night, waiting for strangers to give him a bit of money or food. John began working at one of Richard's stores. Though the job was humble, it was an opportunity for him to start over. Every day, he went to work with a smile on his face, no longer worried about finding shelter or enduring hunger and freezing cold. His life now had new meaning. He could work, earn money, and, most importantly, live with the respect of those around him. Though John's life still faced many challenges, he felt he had regained his dignity. He no longer felt invisible in society, he was now part of it, with a new opportunity. He never forgot to thank Richard every day, not just for the material help, but for giving him hope. The story of Emma and her last dollar didn't just stay in New York. The news of the small but immensely meaningful act by the poor girl spread across the United States. People began sharing the story through media, social networks, and in conversations among friends and family. Emma's act, though without grand intentions, had touched the hearts of millions. She had set an example for others, showing them that kindness doesn't need to be flashy or publicized. Just sincere. Everyone could create a great impact, even through small acts in their everyday lives. Her story didn't just change Richard, it also changed many others, making them reflect on themselves and their actions in life. It reminded everyone that no matter how much money we have, without love, everything becomes meaningless. After the story of Emma and Richard spread, people began to change their perspectives on those around them. No longer were there cold, cautious, or suspicious glances, but warm eyes, ready to share what they had. A smile, a pat on the back, or simply a greeting could make a difference. Every day, people gradually understood that the small things they gave not only helped the recipient but also made them feel happy and fulfilled. And Emma was the one who taught them that valuable lesson. that sometimes, the smallest actions can bring the biggest change. At the end of the story, the message Richard and Emma brought wasn't just about money, but about humanity. Richard realized that, even though he was a billionaire with everything, kindness was the real treasure. And Emma, with just her last dollar, had sparked a major change in society. The final message of the story is that kindness knows no class or social status. Anyone, whether rich or poor, can bring an invaluable gift to this world: love and compassion. And sometimes, a single dollar can be the starting point for a great change. When the story of Emma, John, and Richard spread, it was not just a lesson about kindness, but also a profound message about humanity. In a world full of haste and competition, we sometimes forget that small actions can create the greatest changes. Emma only had one last dollar, but she used it to sow the seeds of love, and that act awakened a whole society. Meanwhile, Richard, after years of chasing power and wealth, realized that love was the most valuable thing. Together, they changed the world, not with power or money, but with humanity and sharing. And that is the final message this story wants to send to you: no matter who you are, no matter what you have, kindness is always the most priceless gift. Remember, it's never too late to start doing something good, whether for yourself or for others. Every action, no matter how small, can spread and change someone's life. If this story has touched your heart, don't hesitate to share it with those around you. Let Gentle Heart Stories continue to be a place where you can find inspiring stories, lessons about humanity, compassion, and kindness. Subscribe to the Gentle Heart Stories channel to never miss out on meaningful and touching stories like this. Let's create a better world together, starting with small but loving actions. Subscribe today and become a part of the Gentle Heart community.